Welcome to JAT Chat, presented by the Journal of Athletic Training, the official journal of the National Athletic Trainers Association. I'm Dr. Shelby Baez, an assistant professor in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at UNC Chapel Hill, and the co-host of JAT Chat with Dr. Kara Radzak. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Yuki Sugimoto. Dr. Sugimoto is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Physical Therapy and Human Movement Sciences at Northwestern University. She is the author of Sensory Reweighting System Differences on Vestibular Feedback with Increased Task Constraints in Individuals with and Without Chronic Ankle Instability, published in the Journal of Athletic Training. Yuki, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
Wonderful. So starting off with a very broad question for our listeners. What do we currently know about outcomes in patients with chronic ankle instability? Are they returning to sport? Are they engaging in physical activity, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a very broad question. So individuals with chronic ankle instability often display heterogeneous impairments, such as pathomechanical impairments and sensory motor dysfunctions. They often experience repetitive perception of ankle giving way, along with residual symptoms such as pain, muscle weakness, reduced ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, maladaptive gait, impaired balance, and so on. So defined chronic ankle instability patients could present in multiple combinations of residual symptoms, and it is very individualized. Those with chronic ankle instability often continue to experience recurrent ankle sprains more than a year after their initial ankle sprains. In terms of returning to sports or engaging in physical activity, first and foremost, ankle sprain is often overlooked and considered as minor injuries. So at least 50% of individuals do not seek any medical care after an initial ankle sprain. But unfortunately, I can't blame them because I had multiple ankle sprains, never sought any medical attention, and now I have chronic ankle instability as well. So that being said, individuals with chronic ankle instability, including athletes, often return to sports or engage in physical activities despite ongoing residual symptoms. The extent of their participation depends on their severity of those symptoms. However, engaging in high-risk activities or collision sports may increase their exposure to recurrence of ankle sprain.
Well, thank you for that comprehensive definition of who these patients are. And as someone who also has chronic ankle instability, I'm really appreciative of all the researchers who are doing this work. Just a follow-up question when thinking about outcomes. What are some of the long-term consequences of potentially not addressing chronic ankle instability? Do these people go on to develop OA, like we think about individuals with traumatic knee injuries?
I think so. I think one of the high risk factor for post-traumatic OA is chronic ankle instability individuals. I'm not too knowledgeable about literature in OA, but I know chronic ankle instability is one of the risk factors for developing post-traumatic osteoarthritis.
Yeah, and just trying to think about this is more than just an ankle sprain and thinking about the consequences of not addressing this across the lifespan. So just curious a little bit about that. You specifically examined this concept of sensory reweighting in this patient population. Can you just provide our listeners of a definition of what sensory reweighting means?
Individuals' ability to distribute weight or their reliance on three primary sensory systems that are somatosensory, vision, and vestibular to obtain relevant sensory feedback from the environment that is constantly changing for them to coordinate best suited motor behaviors. So, for example, healthy individuals supposed to have flexible and adaptable sensory reweighting system to rely on different sensory feedback to obtain most relevant information on ever-changing environment to accomplish given tasks. So in terms of maintaining postural control, it has been suggested healthy individuals rely on 70% of somatosensory feedback, 20% of vestibular feedback, and 10% of visual feedback. However, obviously those ratios may change as constraints of organismic, that is individual state of health and task and environment.
So it sounds like traditionally it's more focused on that somatosensory feedback system. In chronic ankle instability, in patients with chronic ankle instability, was there a shift? I can't remember if you said specifically if there was a shift between reliance on one system more than another.
Yeah, so if they have somatosensory dysfunction, based on the previous literature, CAI individuals tend to heavily rely on visual feedback to compensate diminished somatosensory feedback.
So a lot more reliance on visual feedback instead of this sensory feedback that we see in those who don't have chronic ankle instability. Is that correct?
Right. So healthy individuals have more flexible adaptability, so they are able to change their reliance on different sensory systems based on task and environmental constraints. But maybe for chronic ankle instability individuals, because they may have, somatosensory dysfunction or impairments, they have to rely on specific, single either visual or vestibular feedback to compensate somatosensory impairment.
So it sounds like because this injury potentially damages the somatosensory feedback system, that there's this shift to more of this visual reliance in this patient population.
Right.
So with your specific study, what was your purpose and how did you examine sensory reweighting in this patient population?
We had two primary purposes for our study. So the primary purpose was to understand how sensory reweighting systems are affected by sensory systems and task complexity, while both individuals with and without chronic ankle instability was maintaining posture under different environmental conditions. And then second purpose was to explore how task and environmental constraints could impact postural control in both CAI and healthy groups. So I don't know how everybody is familiar with Neurocom device, but we use Neurocom posturography device to conduct sensory organization test, which is known as SOT. So the SOT comprises 6 conditions and was designed to manipulate somatosensory and visual feedback in combination with sway difference support surface, that is standing platform, and then visual surroundings with and without eyes closed. My manuscript kind of has a table summarizing all this, but the SOT condition 1 to 3 has fixed support surface. And condition 4 to 6 had sway difference support surface. So the platform was moving based on the individual sway. And vision was absent during condition 2 and 5 with eyes closed. And then condition 3 and 6 had sway difference surroundings. So that by means individuals standing, and as they swayed, the surroundings wall was moving based on their sway. So all sensory feedback was intact during condition 1. So meaning they were all 3 sensory feedback 1 manipulated, so they were available. And reliance on somatosensory feedback was tested during conditions 2 and 3. And reliance on visual feedback was tested during condition 4. And vestibular reliance was tested during condition 5 and 6. So what sensory organization tests do is they compute equilibrium balance scores by measuring how well the individual center of gravity sort of stays within expected angular limits of stability. They use those equilibrium scores from specific pairs of SOT conditions. So for example, for somatosensory reliance, they compared condition 2 to 1. Where all sensory feedback was intact, available. And for visual reliance, condition 4 was compared to condition 1. And then for vestibular reliance, condition 5 was compared to condition 1. They also have to compute it to the ratio. So they were all multiplied by 100. So the sensory reweighting ratio closer to 100% represented more reliance on each sensory feedback.
So Yuki, what did you all hypothesize that you were going to see as it relates to differences with these 6 sensory organization test conditions?
Based on the previous literature, the review indicated, chronic ankle instability individuals highly rely on visual feedback to compensate diminished somatosensory feedback. So our hypothesis was definitely, those CAI group will upregulate visual reliance to compensate somatosensory impairments. However, that's not what we saw in our study, so which was kind of surprising to us.
So tell us more. What did you all see? What were the results?
Right. So the most unique findings of our study was that CI group did not downweight on vestibular feedback while maintaining on posture in the injured leg, meaning they actually relied on vestibular feedback. And both chronic ankle instability and healthy groups distributed weight differently on each sensory feedback while maintaining posture in double and uninjured and injured legs. Somatosensory feedback was obviously upweighted, the most while maintaining posture in double leg stance, while both groups actually upweighted on visual feedback to maintain posture in single leg stance, so both uninjured and injured leg stances. And group differences in posture control were influenced by task and environmental constraints. So surprisingly, we did not hypothesize for chronic ankle instabilities to perform or maintain posture compatible to healthy individuals, but our CAI group maintained posture very similar to, or even sometimes better than healthy groups.
As you mentioned, this seems to be different than what you all hypothesized. Do you have any insight into why this group maybe didn't downweight their vestibular feedback system during the different tasks?
Both groups actually benefited from distorted vision to maintain posture, but CAI group did not rely on distorted vision when vestibular feedback became dominant input with distorted somatosensory and visual feedback during condition 5 and 6. I think that's why, because they have to identify their self-motion, so they have to rely on vestibular feedback, which was most accurate for them to retrieve relevant, sensory information for them to maintain posture.
To clarify, what I'm hearing is that based off of the specific task that they were almost forced to have to downweight and maintain and rely on that vestibular feedback system.
Right. So for condition 5 and 6, somatosensory, and for condition 5, somatosensory is manipulated. And then condition 6, both somatosensory and visions are manipulated. And during condition 5, vision is absent because they are maintaining posture with eyes closed. So they are kind of forced to rely on vestibular feedback. So vestibular was only dominant feedback, which provided accurate sensory feedback. But because both groups somewhat benefited from distorted vision, so inaccurate, sensory feedback, so healthy individuals did not have to downregulate on vestibular feedback.
So Yuki, those are very interesting results. Where should the next steps be in this space from a clinical standpoint and from a research standpoint?
Yeah, so from research standpoint, even though our study focused on dynamic posture control, it is probably important to note that sensory reweighting system might work differently for individuals with chronic ankle instability in actual world situations where environment is constantly changing. So I think the next step would be to explore whether the same sensory reweighting patterns persist during more functional tasks, such as walking and running, and maybe transitioning into more sport-specific movement.
Awesome. And the last question I have for you is, can you provide a take-home point about your paper for our listeners?
Yeah. So because both healthy and CAI individuals rely on visual feedback as tasks became more difficult to maintain posture in the uninjured, injured legs, and also chronic ankle instability individuals physically relied on vestibular feedback in addition to visual feedback to maintain posture control in their injured legs. So I think taking a multi-sensory feedback approach by challenging both vestibular feedback with and without vision, or even with distorted vision, may optimize the rehabilitation intervention for individuals with chronic ankle instability to prevent any recurrence of ankle sprain.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that feedback. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. This article is available free of charge by the Journal of Athletic Training. And I highly recommend everyone go and download this manuscript in the Journal of Athletic Training. Yuki, again, thank you so much. And we will see you all next time.
Thank you.